Good evening, everyone. Welcome to KFAS. Thank you for coming to this talk today, which will be about entrepreneurs' experiences from around the world, given by Alisee De Tonnac, who is the co-founder of Seedstar World Competition. We'll start off with the talk, followed by a Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Alisee.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm doing a really poor job representing Switzerland because since I have arrived, I have been systematically late. And I need to tell you the last story of why I've arrived a bit late tonight. So this is where technology goes wrong. I have the message from Aisha saying, okay, the car is going to be a silver Chevrolet. So I find a silver Chevrolet in front of my hotel. I enter it, the person nods. So for me, it's kind of a confirmation we're good to go. And we start driving and he's starting to look at me more and more. And then suddenly he's like, okay. So I'm like, really cool. He takes out Google Translator. It's linked with the Bluetooth to his car. So he's saying something in Arab. The car is speaking back to me. And she's saying, where did you get the cream? And I'm like, I'm sure that's not what you're trying to tell me. And he's like, cream. And I'm like, no, I don't think it's cream you want to talk about. So he's like, okay, I'll try again. So he speaks in Arabic and then the car translates to me. Why did you eliminate Kareem? So I was like, look, if I had that kind of power, I wouldn't be here right now. And then finally, he starts showing me pictures, and that's why we have this aha moment that I'm probably not supposed to be in this car, and that he has another passenger on Kareem waiting for him at the hotel. So came back, found the silver Chevrolet, and finally I'm here today. I think kind of the moral of the story is that technology should be an enhancer of experiences, but still when you can't find that seamless experience, it becomes definitely a bottleneck for human interactions. Anyways, I'm very excited to be here. I've had a wonderful day speaking with all the different stakeholders that represent the Kuwaiti innovation ecosystem. And in my very short time, KFAS and their team have really shown to me and been so like the Kuwaiti hospitality has been proven in such a short time. So thank you to the whole team for the support. What I'm going to talk about is not mostly about lipstick, but just quickly tell you a bit of my background was I was indeed selling very expensive lipstick. And as much as I learned a lot during my experience in the cosmetic group, I really felt quickly, and I think I'm in many ways a representation of a generation where you have this kind of complacence and lack of purpose, which in many ways was for me a definition of unhappiness. So many moments led to me leaving and starting to build Seedstars, but I think one that highlighted a lot this kind of turning point for me was when I came across this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that says, do one thing every day that scares you. And I was shocked at how unscared I was on a regular basis. So that kind of became my motto of terrifying myself. And I came across, luckily, met my founders. And I say luckily because now that I've met so many entrepreneurs, I know it's a trial and error to figure out what's the right team to build the business with. But I was luckily enough to find at the first trial my co-founders. And since we've been building Seedstars, which has led us in many ways to great adventures around the world. I think one other moment, which again kind of is a representation of our generation, is there's this great blog, Wait But Why, that maybe many of you know. And I found it shocking that in one slide you could put all the weeks of your life. And so from there was also a realization of, okay, if I had that in some way limited amount of weeks in my lifetime, how did I want to set my steps in this planet Earth, at least for today, this planet Earth, and how did I want to bring value? And so came about the mission of Seedstars when in 2013 we launched ourselves in kind of making a study of what were the entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. So we went to 20 ecosystems and I left this kind of postcard, Switzerland, very tranquil lifestyle to a much more chaotic reality where I was also fortunate to spend some time and live in Nigeria, for example, which here is the streets of Lagos, the economical capital of Nigeria, which in itself is a city of what's estimated 20 million people. for a country of over 180 million people. So before telling you about Seedstars, in many ways, when I was thinking about Kuwait, I was thinking also about Switzerland because it's also a very small country. So Switzerland historically didn't have resources. So very much from day one, they had to capitalize and understand how to nurture innovation and human capital and put a premium on human capital. And I think that's also a lot of the reflections that are going on in Kuwait. Switzerland is, of course, famous for its watches, its very good chocolate. I'm pretty sure you have more luxurious brands in mind when it comes to watches, but it also is actually a real place of innovation. It's historically won many of the different innovation indexes around the world, but also, for example, they have one of the highest investment in research and development in terms of percentage of the total GDP. And in that investment in R&D, much of it is allocated to higher education. So there has been a very focused strategy of allocating on education and specifically across industry so that they could build a very strong competitive edge, but not at a local, regional level, but at a global level. So that's said, Seedstars, our mission is to have an impact in emerging markets through technology and entrepreneurship. Why? Because we felt like there was kind of three mega trends that were setting themselves, and we wanted to be kind of at the sweet spot between those trends. One was the rise of emerging markets, which we kind of quickly categorize still when I hear European investors, the West and the rest, which is shocking because the rest is taking over the West. So now we're accounting for 85% of the world population. You have also the democratization of technology. You have to imagine that it took us over 100 years to get to 1 billion consumers for the telephone and less than 10 years for 1 billion consumers for the smartphone. So the adoption rate at which we can scale a new technology to the mass is getting faster and faster and faster. And then also there's this rise of this entrepreneurship generation. And I think from kind of the meetings I had today, but also from what we're mapping out across the different ecosystem, it's that it's a global movement. So you have this rise of a generation that wants to build, that wants to be very active in building, in rethinking the status quo across different industries. And this is happening worldwide. It's estimated around 400 million entrepreneurs. But the interesting thing for us is that it's also a generation, again, not a developed country construct. Now, most of the millennials, so-called, are located in emerging markets. But we're talking about a generation that believes that profit and purpose go hand in hand. And that's very powerful because it means that they're also investing and putting their brains in industries where they need to be reshaped and rethink for a longer term purpose. So our take was when we wanted to invest and support in these entrepreneurs in emerging markets, what you realize quickly is that there's kind of this disbalance between the capital inflow, which is mostly linked to the immaturity of the ecosystem. Here is a quick comparison that I made between the London ecosystem and Tanzania, which is the latest campus that we have just opened in Africa. And what you can see is that there's a disproportionate amount of what we call the ecosystem stakeholders, maybe the co-working space, the accelerators, the government agencies, the different incubator programs that help and support the infrastructure to build a more robust pipeline of qualitative investment opportunities. And what we see kind of across the region is that if you have not hit a certain maturity of ecosystem, it's very difficult to attract capital inflow. And so we at Seedstars are trying to figure out what maturity level do we need to build to attract money, because money there is. That's not necessarily the issue. It's more how do you allocate that in the investment opportunities and what support do you provide to scale. And so we now operate the largest startup competition in emerging markets. We come to Kuwait now for a couple of years with our partner who's here from Seedstar Lab. We also have now different programs through our campuses. And just to give you some examples of companies we invested in where we weren't confident initially on the scalable model is, for example, AgroCenta from Ghana, which was our winner from last year, started out as a marketplace to connect small farm holders with international buyers, and quickly, as you know, in many markets where there's a lack of infrastructure, they started integrating the whole value chain. So now they're the ones that are becoming the buyers themselves. They are the ones buying the warehouses to store and the produce so that they stay of better quality, so that they can sell larger amounts to bigger international buyers. And they're also now acting as a bank, providing the loans to the small farm holders so that they can increase their produce. Or our winner of this year was Acuden from Argentina, which is kind of an education platform, the Slack of education, where you connect professors, all the different education facilities, and also the education app and content, so that everyone is kind of speaking on one platform, and then you have different benefits and services. And now they have over 250,000 monthly unique visitors and really scaling across the region. They've just closed Series A and hoping to scale to the next continent. We have physical campuses because we're still human, so there's a level of physicality that needs to stay, and now we're in 12 locations around the world, from Colombia to Nigeria to Myanmar. And these campuses, or outside of these campuses, we operate different programs according to the maturity of the business to help and support them and scale to the next level. So maybe what I wanted, when I was thinking of kind of, okay, so what would be the opportunities for the entrepreneurs locally, and how maybe they should tackle these different markets and technologies, was I think people are still underestimating the trend around impact investing, which is really, really starting to scale more and more. And you'll see all the big are starting to enter. Why? Because in a very easy way to classify the challenges that we have in the next decade, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The reality is many studies prove that we'll probably be needing $5 trillion US per year to achieve 2030 objectives. So that's a lot of capital we need to pour into these challenges through different allocations of different businesses. And the interesting thing is, when you click on the keyword impact investing on Google, the trend is clearly growing more and more. The big guys are entering it. So maybe the Goldman Sachs, the BlackRock, they're either acquiring impact funds, allocating a certain proportion to it, or, I mean, for example, recently Partners Group in Switzerland is allocating $1 billion to the ESG, which is also another kind of definition to sustainability and environmental investment allocation. And so I think many entrepreneurs from emerging markets tackling maybe the Arab world, the MENA region, by default, many of your businesses fall under the SDGs. And it's really interesting to start also looking into what is the impact investing landscape going through, who are the types of investors, what are the allocation attributions for. And it can go from international DFIs, so the development banks of Europe, or by country. And it also can be family offices that more and more we see. In Switzerland, which still has 1/3 of private wealth globally, they are allocating to impact investing only. And so, of course, the opportunity is still here. If you see the number of unicorns, emerging markets is still very small, the number. So there's definitely the opportunity to scale when we see the macro numbers links to the economic powerhouses that are being built across these different markets. So today, Seedstars, we now have a portfolio of 50 investments across different sectors. So at a very small seed stage level, we're trying also to participate, not only on the capacity side, but also on the investment side. Another trend that I want to push, because especially when I travel to GCC, so maybe here I've heard it less, but there is kind of this obsession to go to Le Sacré Graal, which is the United States. Okay, that's kind of the ultimate market you want to achieve. Okay, but it doesn't make it easier. Competition and the complexity of the market is also very difficult to assess. And I keep saying, look at the rest of the world, especially Kuwait geographically. It's very interesting to look into markets like Bangladesh, Pakistan, even India, a continent in itself. But there are so many opportunities that you probably understand much better and fathom much more the challenges and what would be the appropriate operating model on the ground, that I understand the kind of obsession around the noise and this idea that the feasibility of testing your prototype will be easier in the US or a more mature market that has the rest of the infrastructure. But sometimes the pains that the challenges that you're trying to solve might have an easier buy-in in these markets that don't have the same legacy, cultural heritage, or lobbying effects of the bigger groups. So the 85, just to be clear, it's an opportunity when I see the gap still from the developed economies and the more frontier markets. For me, it's an opportunity because it's very clear that any consumer, potential consumer that you see in Nigeria or Bolivia or the Philippines, everyone wants a good healthcare system. Everyone wants the best education for their child, and everyone wants to buy nice things. So you potentially have a customer that is looking for similar opportunities that you have seen are successful in these more mature, established markets. And it's true, one indicator on how we can assess the economic value of entering a new market could be GDP per capita, which gives us a good indicator of purchasing power. But at Seedstars, there's more this investment on the long term on asking yourself, okay, if we shifted the lenses, suddenly these green zones become red because we're looking in terms of percentage of people without internet. Yes, it's still a reality that 4 billion people do not have access to internet, and that's very much located in these emerging markets. But every year, you're getting hundreds of millions of new consumers and citizens you can connect to, and you can potentially sell their service and enhance their day-to-day experience. I remember in 2013, we were going to India for the first time, and they're like, yeah, you know, our internet penetration is still quite low. We're around the 10%, and we're like, whoa, 10%, it's like bad. And then you do 10%, 1.3 billion, that's good. So it's just, there's always this kind of reflection that they're so far behind, but that so far behind sometimes makes you believe you are first, and in the reality, you don't understand the opportunities of leapfrogging to new technologies. And well, these are other numbers that reconfirm kind of the magnitude of emerging markets, knowing that the whole workforce is going to be located in these markets, and basically tomorrow everyone's going to be connected. Okay, that's not the issue, and they'll have a device that is more or less powerful in their hands. But maybe I'd like to jump into the subject of leapfrogging. So leapfrogging a technology is when you skip one generation of technology directly to the next, and it is always more efficient, less costly, and more sustainable. And so what's interesting about these markets is that you actually have this leapfrogging effect more and more across all industries, taking place at a faster pace than what we're seeing in Europe or the States, for example. So historically, the most obvious example that we have across all regions is that skipping landlines directly to mobile phones. And from that, we have built new economies. So it's never been about job destruction in many of these economies. It has been about job creation from day one. So in the case of, thanks to having access to the internet through your mobile, you talk, of course, of m-commerce before anything else. And you see the scale, the exponential growth of m-commerce is much faster in emerging markets. Historically, how the payment has been done is, I think it goes back to the Roman Empire with checks, and then we had cash and credit cards, and now we have different payment solutions on our mobile phone, but it actually goes way back to 2002 with GCash in the Philippines, because we had this huge emergency of transferring money for a population of 90 million people spread out across 7,000 islands. So it was a basic technology that we could be doing for a long time, but because of lobbying, because of infrastructure costs, because also the consumer habit to cash and credit cards, the shift of having a mass adoption of mobile payment was much tougher. To the extent that you now have economies like Kenya, where their literacy rate is still very low, but their financial literacy is probably much higher than many economies in Europe. You have to imagine that over 50% of the GDP of the whole economy of Kenya is processed through one mobile app called M-Pesa, maybe you've heard of. And now it's these typical technologies that are heading back in the Western world because they've been able to prove it at scale. And this was mainly due to the fact that there wasn't the same banking regulation, telco operator could function. There was such a need for a solution, as most adults in the world today do not have access to bank accounts. So it was for the majority of the population a way to formalize their activities and access different financial services. And so you see now the fintech adoption rate starts to be highest in emerging markets. And I recently saw a study that apparently the most financial service innovations are coming out right now from sub-Saharan Africa. And so these are type of investments that we have done on loans for SMEs or individuals, leveraging technology where it's best, of building the right data set so that we could have a better credit profiling to provide loans to more individuals, but also to more SMEs that wanted to scale. Another example is electricity. I mean, this is how we have built light in cities across Europe. When I was living in Nigeria, for example, I was fortunate enough to pay myself a generator fueled by gas. Very painful in terms of noise, maintenance. We still had 10 power cuts per day. And now we're finding more and more solutions, again, coming from Latin America, from Africa, which are these decentralized microgrid solutions, mostly powered on solar or electric. There are now different types of energy source. And here again, what's interesting is that because of the challenges on the ground, you have to leapfrog directly to a new model, which usually we are seeing coming out from the startups, and then they scale through different programs, and then government comes in. And so here what you have is, of course, purchasing power being very different. Your approach to how you will sell your product will be very different. In this case, for a solar kit that can generate electricity for one home, it's around $200. You go through M-Pesa, the app, for example, and you buy it at $1 per day until you have full ownership until the end of the year. And you can even plug into that some insurance. And the beauty now is that we're seeing companies coming out from Bangladesh, for example, that have built a new economy where it's a marketplace that allows micro-entrepreneurs to produce and sell their own energy. So now out of SoulShare, there are over 10,000 micro-entrepreneurs that are being built. So a full new ecosystem derives out of these challenges, where the European trends or historical way how we have been set up, or other countries, does not support the case for these current ecosystems. And there will need to be a very different business model where open innovation and entrepreneurs and startups can really make a difference. Then I was asked also to maybe share some of the elements that I have started to see across the different regions in terms of what are some of the success ingredients to high growth businesses. I talk about high growth businesses versus startups because there's a lot of confusion around what a startup is. A high growth business is a startup to the extent that, yes, it's a company over time that has an exponential growth over consecutive years. And also, according to many studies, for example, Nesta did a report on the UK industry. These high growth businesses actually accounted for over 50% in job creation and GDP growth of the economy. So we've been trying to focus on such businesses because we believe they can have a disproportionate impact. It doesn't mean that you don't consider the rest of the entrepreneurs. You have your micro entrepreneurs, you have your SMEs, and there are tailored support and financing mechanisms for these businesses. But in terms of high growth businesses, I think really the kind of key word to that is, what is the scalability of your model? And some kind of general reflection is, one, if you're in it to build a high growth business, cut out the noise because it's going to take time. As much as you read TechCrunch and as much as you hear these outliers, and it's great to have success stories of unicorns in the regions like Kareem, etc., it still takes 10 to 15 years from all the studies to build a business. And the first valley of death is around the third year, where you kind of have exhausted friend, families, and fool money, so the FFF, or the pre-seed money you could get from government or other private public initiatives. So that's kind of your first valley of death. And then you experience a second one, which is around the 7-year period. So this is more on a European data set that I have these analysis. And in that 7 year is more your capability of managing the cash flow and entering into a machine that scales. So it takes a lot of time, and we all know it, but from somehow we always forget it, that your timeline looks much messier than anything you could have ever planned. And that's something that I think afterwards you need to integrate in your culture if you want to build scalability and a high growth business, because to the extent that we, for example, have 8 values at Seedstars, and one of them is, I don't know, I don't have it, so I'll show it to you later. The other one is fail. I think, again, it's kind of an overused word, and everyone's talking about failure. Failure doesn't mean like, don't be stupid, don't be illegal. Don't like do everything from scratch. You can learn so much and avoid so much, and you can play it in a smart way. But failure in the sense that you build a level of experimentation in your machine so that you constantly stay very close to the market. All we know from the future is that we're not ready at the pace at which we're going. We don't have the education system or the government system that is going to support the jobs of tomorrow. We have very little clue of what that's going to look like. So your best shot is to have that capability of agility and resilience as a human, but also as a business. And for that, I think at a national level and how government speaks to their pool of talent, there needs to be kind of a level of support in failure. And so that goes through the bankruptcy laws, that goes through many different initiatives, but also within the company and the culture. And we've seen so many different ways people have formalized failure. It goes from failure bonuses that we've seen in larger corporations. So there's an extent to which the better you fail, the bigger the bonus, or you have certain budget ceilings. So under a certain amount, we don't even want to see what you're doing with it as long as you're coming up with new ideas. So there's different mechanisms to keep that in place because, and this was one of the values we have, which is stay outside your comfort zone. So it's really something that then you have to formalize every day in your culture. And I think if you want to be a high growth business today, that's something that really you can't underestimate. The wisdom of the crowd. There's so many studies that show it, but maybe one example is there's Francis Sultan, which is a statistician, he went to a fair in the 1800s, and there was a big cow, and they were trying. The objective was the participants of the fair had to guess the weight of the cow. And so there were over 800 participants. He collected all the answers. And what he saw was that actually the average answer of the crowd was 1% off the actual weight. The answer was better than that of the expert or the winner. So the wisdom of the crowd works. It works under 3 conditions, however. You need a diverse set of people, diverse meaning different backgrounds, different opinions. You need an independent pool of people. It means people don't feel influenced to change their opinion. And you need a decentralized decision making. So it's not one authority deciding what is the best idea, but it's a sum of the ideas collected. And that for me today translates in company that you have to be super comfortable in diversity. Like, it's not a nice to have. It's not because you want to be nice to people you're less accustomed to. It's because you understand that it's a way to make a successful business. Because out of diversity, you will probably have better answers, better results, and a better representation of your consumer base that will be forever more fragmented and less loyal to one product and one service. So I think there's also huge work that needs to be done in how do you maintain a pool of talent that is representative of the market you want to address, and that can help you continue and perform at best. And then, the kind of obvious, which is think scale, which goes back to what I was mentioning before, and we've heard it through the lean startup methodology, and many have put words to it and made it very simple. I think we know what it means when it comes to an athlete. We accept the fact that it's mostly hours of training and missing the shots, the goals, the whatever. We can understand it when it comes to scientific research, that the level of precision to get to something that has fundamental evidence is years of laboratory testing. But then when it comes to entrepreneurs, there's this kind of, the gut should tell us what to do, and success is intrinsic, and you're it or you're not. No, it's the same level of systematic approach of building an experimentation pipeline, learning from it, building a knowledge tool out of it so that you can disseminate the successful learnings, and that you can reduce your errors by trying to eliminate the assumptions that you had initially. And that in many companies that we've met and seen how they scale, there is an understanding that now they have to come to a level of a machine, and every function, every product, every service has to be thought at scale. And that means putting in place a certain level of process, putting in place a certain level of automation of what is not core, and understanding how you can get to that much bigger ambition, which leads to also scale at the level of culture. I don't remember who said, I remember having read this, so it doesn't come from me, but culture is management at scale. So your capability of managing a high-performing team that is going to continue and grow as your business grows will be in your capability in maintaining cohesion in the culture that you have set. So at Seedstars, we've been very rigorous with ourselves, but also in how we assess teams and their potential to scale on what is the investment, the resources, and the understanding they have in training their leadership team, in training their whole business, and what are their kind of key success factors linked to their culture. And so here were kind of the values that we have. We've actually added one, which is no excuse. They're aggressive enough that you're not supposed to like us, all of you, because it should be specific enough that it fits to how we want to operate, which I think is very important, because the kind of value that fits for all quickly becomes irrelevant and usually lacks authenticity and integrity, which probably is the worst way. Like, it's a repellent to attract millennials, and I don't even want to talk about the Generation Z or whatever we're naming them. I believe with this level of transparency we're getting to, as democratization of technology is happening and we're all connected through different social media, authenticity, I think, is going to become more and more key to retain your talent and have them own up to a level of accountability on the jobs that they do. So, and maybe finally going back to kind of the different trends I shared with you on impact investing, but more generally on the population I think we represent globally, is that we need to make the effort to prove the world that profit and purpose works. And so historically, this has been quite separated. And so you had the CSR arm. You would define kind of what was your drivers of profit. You had the luxury maybe also to not apprehend too much what were the long-term impacts on the environment and on society, but we don't have a choice anymore. So there needs to be much more people invested in reflecting on what's the appropriate framework to build scalable, profitable businesses with a very high level of purpose. And at Seedstars, for the moment, we've worked a lot on it. It's a very complicated slide, but it's just there is one framework out there that comes from the development space, which in itself says limitations, but it's the theory of change framework, which tries to assess what are the tangible metrics that lead to an intended impact that you have. And so we've built our theory of change across two very main drivers, which is profit and purpose. So on one side, we need to be profitable because we believe a healthy organization and a performing organization will probably be your best bet in teaching others how to be a healthy organization and a performing organization. So that's kind of how we've built the principles, and according to that also we've built the values, we've built the type of talents we want to recruit, and it kind of tumbles down to the day-to-day objectives that you set your team. So it becomes very powerful when you're starting to scale. And I think everyone has that intention. Every entrepreneur I've met has the integrity to build something meaningful. If not, they wouldn't be an entrepreneur. There are much easier ways out. But we're still lacking framework because we're lacking also historical evidence and benchmarks. And it would be great to have more minds on this so that we can replicate this model as soon as possible. So yeah, we've got $5 trillion per year before 2030 to reach the SDG objectives. It seems an enormity, but there's one thing that holds true in history. And I think that's why our activities and the way we invest and the way we support our businesses goes back at a very individual level. Because as Margaret Mead said it so beautifully, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alisée. Thank you. We'll now start with the Q&A session. Please use the mics on either side of the seat so that everyone in the auditorium can hear.
What I want to ask you is today, the Nobel authorities in Oslo just gave the Nobel Prize in economics to a guy called Banerjee, Apiti Banerjee. He's at MIT, and then there's a lady also with him. And their main, the reason they gave it them is they wrote a study on this disparity between the rich and the poor. And you know, it's increasing more with time. Given that sort of thing working against people in the emerging market, because people like, you know, well, the rich can get very rich, especially that, like Amazon is almost a country. Yeah. Alibaba will be the fifth largest GDP in the world by 2025. What are our chances of succeeding against these giants? And that difference is increasing all the time. By the time we catch up, they already had another 20 years.
Yeah. So historically, if you look at the data, we're actually doing better. I mean, extreme poverty is reducing. The number of wars are reducing. The number of trade connections, which in many ways shows the, the stability of globalization is continuing to increase. And Ray Dalio, for example, which is one of the big investors, or Matthew Jackson, which is a very famous, I think he was also up for one of the Nobel Prize. They've proven through human connection and also the history that it's very cyclical. So many of them can anticipate these highs and lows that we live. And why? Because there's a moment where the rich are too rich and there's a form of revolution, whatever war, whatever happens, clash because it's not possible anymore, and then it reduces and it goes back up. That said, so I'm quite optimistic about the future of the world, and every entrepreneur I meet confirms that to me. So it's true, I'm meeting a very elitist pool of citizens, but I believe they can have a disproportionate impact on our society. When it comes to these huge groups that are becoming monopolies across many industries, I mean, if you think of any bank today that is considering the future, no bank will tell you their competitor is another bank. Their competitor is Google, Amazon, Facebook. So it's absolutely true. And I'm a big believer in free trade, but there is going to be a level of regulation so that we ensure, and as we've done historically with these very large monopolies, to give to give a level of chance to other companies. But we must not forget that also the Alibaba, the Amazon are in themselves huge participants in the growth of the different innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. So they have been the ones that have provided the first risks, investments across key industries. They're the ones that have trained pools of talents. So I wouldn't underestimate the value that they have on society. And yes, I think at a certain level of when they become bigger than a country, and the weight that they have at a global level, which is detrimental to some of the basic citizen rights in countries, there should be some form of regulation. And you're slowly seeing it. The problem is government is not as agile as the private sector. So now we're starting to see data privacy laws. Now we're starting to see regulation on how they've dismantled themselves for fiscal reasons. We need a more competent authority that can react faster, because we're going to get tougher questions to answer when AI kicks in for real. But I'm optimist.
I have one question, just how to choose a co-founder? So
yeah. It's very tough. So when I joined my partners, they had a much longer entrepreneurial background. And Pierre-Alain, one of my co-founders, I remember I was like, why aren't we choosing like the top tech guy? Why aren't we choosing like the stars in competencies that we need so that we can scale? And he told me, which I think was the right answer at that time, was you need to set your team on values, because they'll be the only things that are going to help you survive the highs, which are as absurd as the lows. And it's the values that are going to let you survive those moments. And it's true, 7 years later, we're still the same. Now, it doesn't mean that we haven't been harsh on one another, saying, you know what, now where the company lies today and the needed competencies that we need, loyalty is one thing, but now we need also certain competencies that you can't provide. So we've always been very honest in saying there is a relationship as shareholder, there is a relationship as being part of the executive team, there is a relationship as potentially be part of the advisory board, and for every status that you have within the business, we need to be able to make sure we make the best decision for the company. But initially, I do think it's powerful to choose your founders on values, which in many times are going to be linked to the type of values you want to communicate to your company, and not on competencies. You might, the relationship might not last as long. And it's a long, I mean, it's the biggest marriage. It ruins marriages. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have a...
No, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I can tell you, myself, I've started 3 businesses in my life, and I failed in all of them, actually. And for me, it's okay for me, because I think it was a learning experience for me. But for my teenager son who's in high school, he thinks his father is a loser, you know? And my question is, how can we let the young generation, especially in Kuwait, more than 44% of the Kuwaiti population are under the age of 20 years old. how can we let them embrace that it's okay to try and lose, it's okay to start something, it may not work. Is it, from your experience, you went around the world, is there something as a parent or as a school, something we can do to let them embrace this idea rather than just thinking, because I think our school system only brings somebody to become a good employee, not a good entrepreneur.
So I think most education systems are failing. We're starting to have some good examples from some Nordic countries. There are private initiatives, but seeing it at scale at a national level, we haven't seen much yet. And it's really one of the industries that need to be massively disrupted, because we've built kind of in a very, you know, divided by age, divided by curriculum, set classes. I mean, it's the contrary to where we need to go. Studies have shown that it starts very young to set a mindset. And so we're talking about 10, 13-year-olds. And for that, if we want to think at scale, we need the government involved to rethink national education. We're trying to, what we called our seed camps, trying to pilot these workshops for younger students. And it's unbelievable, actually, the interest that they have, because it's usually a format that's much more adapted to kids than sitting in classes and listening to a teacher for hours. So the results are very impressive immediately. So there's no need of convincing too many people, but it's trying to add that in the curricular system at a national level. And then what we've seen personally, how it's been done is that, yeah, it's still very much on the parents to take it up, which is tough because success breeds success. So role models work very well in this case. Again, I mean, it's so obvious for us when we think of sports. There's this great football player and suddenly the whole 5 to 15 generation wants to become this football player. It's the same in business. So we have to build these role models where kids can identify, and from them give them opportunities and infrastructure that actually allows them to have a roadmap to that potential career opportunity. But culture of failure, as we were discussing this before, seriously, outside of Silicon Valley, I haven't seen it. You see more or less more initiatives, there's more history, there's better track record, there's more unicorns. So there is this virtual cycling building ecosystem. But that level of acceptance of failure to the point that if you have not failed, you're probably not bankable yet, I haven't seen it anywhere else than in Silicon Valley. And countries that I've found very impressive that have at a nation level rethought their education system has been, for example, South Korea or Singapore. There are maps that show the GDP per capita of South Korea 50 years ago. It's twice as big as that of Nigeria. Today, it's 24 times higher. So in one lifetime, a whole nation has completely reinvented its positioning globally, and very much was in the effort at a national level to invest heavily on education, building a roadmap for them to be global leaders in specific industries. I mean, people know Samsung more than they know about South Korea. And that has become a very successful model. Now they need to transition into the knowledge economy, and they're tackling some issues on that. But Singapore also is a very similar case where 50 years ago it was close to Malaysia's number. Yes, sorry, he was raising his hand before.
First of all, thank you for the great talk.
Thank you.
I myself have a software solutions startup, and I have noticed that a lot of people or a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't actually have a feasibility study or even a business plan. They just have an enthusiasm about their idea and they want to start right away. And they try to minimize the cost as much as possible, even the operation cost, instead of actually looking for an investor to give the project its a true value. So my question is the feasibility study and business plan really important, and how much someone should invest on the feasibility study?
Yeah.
I mean, how long does it take to actually prepare a good feasibility study?
Yeah.
I mean, a trial and error is not a shame, but why do it all the time? And Why don't you start with a feasibility study first or a business plan before you actually? Many people, they don't do actually market research. They don't know if their services or products are actually on demand or not. They're not sure if it's a market fit.
So now I think I've been biased because I linked feasibility study to that and linked to the National Fund, and it looks very heavy. But a business plan in general, yes. Again, here I think, we're so good in storytelling. Sometimes the whole community has now banned business plans forever. And anyone that asks you a business plan doesn't know how to scale a business. Not true. However, as an investor, I'm much more attracted to see your Excel sheet on a number of experiments you've tested on the market, to see what was the purchasing power of your potential clients you had in mind, to see what's your cost of acquisition of such a client, to have some sense of your what would be your potential suppliers, if so. So that Excel, for me, is 10 times more powerful than a business plan where you haven't done anything yet on the market. For me. Especially also because I'm more of a categorized under a European investor, where we do like seeing some level of strategy to monetize. If you want to go big on huge pools of users, maybe go to Silicon Valley, where you have moonshots and people are willing to listen to that. But if not, a market understanding to the point where you've actually interacted with your potential customer, you've built a first prototype and seen what its limitations, is more powerful than a 100% pure theoretical study. Now, a business plan is also, you've done some experimentation on the ground, you've done a kind of higher analysis of the market potential, but by the way, every deck I've seen, they never have a poor market potential, and there's always great figures, and we're always in the billions. So, it's a question of packaging, so you can quickly package it well too. It's true that when I have a certain limits of time and I need to assess the team and the opportunity, actual numbers make the difference.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is pretty much along the line with what Mr. Gentleman's asked. So what I want to know is, as you know, that Kuwait is lagging behind Saudi Arabia and UAE when it comes to the emerging number of startups. So the main reason this can be attributed to is because of lack of awareness. So how can we really tackle that as a country?
Lack of awareness, and in what sense? Lack of awareness of the youth, or like employees or other talents?
So pretty much everything. So things like human capital, networking, these stuff, the country is not really performing, to the optimal level. So how can we tackle that as a country?
So many things to do. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and if it was just a checklist, it would be the best thing ever. But I think, again, if we want to talk national, it's very difficult to discuss this without government involved. And so you need a national strategic policy, you need national legislation that is in favor and that shows commitment in terms of investment and talent, that has for objective to build this pipeline and build this awareness. I think Kuwait is a great example of a bottom-up approach of different players coming in and really proving sustainable models, because they know there's a real value proposition for these potential talents to build their businesses. And that, for me, is the best on-the-ground experimentation that you could prove to the government that there's something worth scaling. Because the hard work of prototyping has been done to a certain extent. Again, when we think national, for me, you need government involvement, and that's in many ways why UAE and Saudi Arabia have, in very short period, especially Saudi Arabia, increased their pipeline of international and local talent. It doesn't mean that there's a fragmented market still. It doesn't mean that there's suddenly great exits, but there is a very strong focus and investment and talent dedication towards this subject. Yeah, I think you were, sorry, raising your...
Thank you for your crisp presentation. I have a two-part question, probably. First off, all economists, channels, bulletins, mags, they're talking about the global recession that will hit
Yeah.
us all in 2020. So what's going to be the impact on entrepreneurs and the ecosystem that you were talking
Yeah.
about? Number two would be in the face of a global recession, and let me quote, they call it dangerous or ugly. What should be the action plan for entrepreneurs?
Ooh. So yes, you're right. I think we're heading towards a global recession, and I mean, what's the alternative? Okay, maybe because it's your future at stake. So if the alternative is just to be a victim of the recession, then not the sexiest approach. But yes, it's really going to hurt the entrepreneurship. It's going to hurt capital inflow. We're going to have probably a reduction of the number of risky investments. But then again, I mean, there's such little trust on the market that PE is growing. Private equity in general is growing. So it's tough because we're going towards tough times, but I think it's also going to clean out some level of inefficiencies that can be rebuilt by entrepreneurs. It's tough to say. I wouldn't be able to give a founded, like a sound, more deep reflection on this, sorry, at this stage. I would need to go in the books a bit more on what recession will entail. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had a couple of questions. Given your experience looking at startups on a global level,
Yeah.
Can you tell us what are the most prominent industries or opportunities within different regions globally? And if you can maybe talk a bit more about the MENA region specifically, what stands out the most in different countries within the MENA region? And the other question is, I visited 5 startup ecosystems in the United States, and usually in Kuwait we say, oh, this will never work because we're in Kuwait, like we're struggling with this. But when I went and visited those ecosystems, I realized that they experienced the same struggles.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to know is, what are the common challenges that you see across the board, and what are the success factors within startups you've seen globally?
Okay, so first question, global trends and if there's anything specific to MENA, right? I think they're just global trends because quickly every time I try to specify to MENA, I'm like, everyone's tackling this actually, because it's very similar struggles that we're trying to reshape. So fintech is huge because it's also a real source of data collection on your consumers. So then it can be enormous, the amount of possibilities that you have. Okay, you have the technology trends, so drones, AI, I think 3D printing were at the very beginning. And so you have all these kind of very tech-related trends. And then you have all the more industry trends linked more to the local challenges, and every more and more all sectors are being impacted. So fintech and now insurtech is becoming bigger and bigger. You're seeing, of course, agriculture, which is a huge part of the GDP of many economies. You see in energy, and so renewable energy, because we're at a crisis on a global level. You're starting to see logistics, waste management becoming sexier and sexier, so better talent and investment that is going towards that. All the different marketplaces across industries, all the software services, SaaS models will always be here as long as businesses exist. And you're starting to see education and healthcare, even though it's still not easy to find a scalable model, because in education, your main client many times is the government. So that is an issue in itself at scale. And in healthcare, in many of these markets, you have and including in the MENA region, you have such an issue of who's going to pay. And because there's still not a complete ecosystem between the insurance, between the government, between the clinics, the hospitals, the different pharmaceutical companies. So that whole ecosystem is very complicated. And so figuring out what is going to be in the end, who's going to pay, is very difficult to scale such solutions. So again, I can tell you very specific initiatives that have worked, from acceleration programs, from investment funds, from high growth businesses. Again, if you want to talk scale, so at a nation level, it's government regulation, it's the capability of having the right incentives so that businesses want to start, entrepreneurs want to jump in. They can fail to a certain extent until they build something scalable. They have the access to investment rounds at different stages. They have access to the talent pool needed to scale these businesses. And where you see governments, like, as I was mentioning before, like Singapore, South Korea, or ones like I'm seeing also in Mexico and Colombia right now, where they're investing heavily. Even Saudi Arabia, the pace at which they're allowing themselves to implement such legislations or initiative is, for me, what's going to make the difference.
Hello, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. I have a question regarding the ecosystem here in Kuwait. You mentioned you have experiences in developing countries where the government don't have a lot of money to spend. We have a problem because of the exact opposite. For example, I have a solution targeting enterprise and government, and the enterprise, they get it right away and they buy it because it saves them money and increases their productivity.
Yeah.
But when I want to target government enterprises with the same solution, they don't care about improving their productivity, or they don't care about saving money because they have infinite amounts of it, basically. So have you any experiences or any pointers in this regard?
So I'm not the government's best friend, in the sense that I haven't figured out also a model of scale of partnership when it comes to these businesses that we invest in or support. Most governments are dysfunctional in a way, like many large corporates, that the business's intention of being more profitable or more cost efficient goes against the political agenda, goes against keeping your seat. So it's not a business decision. Then again, when I train my sales team, I tell them most of the time it's not a business decision. So if you want to be a good salesman, you better understand what's the underlying factor behind it. But government is a tricky client in any country, I have felt. The process is more transparent and clear, so you know you have to go through a bidding process, but in the most transparent markets, there's still a level of lobbying, which can be very nicely packaged, but it's still what it is, and the level of corruption that makes it difficult, or lobbying or friendships that makes it difficult for you to win. So it's not easy. It's not easy. You have some, like for example, Singapore, I thought was very interesting. All salaries of the Ministry of Singapore is in correlation with the GDP growth of the country. So they're extremely well paid, so that they would get, in Singapore actually, probably one of the highest status would be to work in government, because it's extremely well paid, because you have huge accountability, your bonuses are linked to the GDP of the country, and so they're able to attract kind of extremely performing talent that would otherwise have gone to the private sector. And I thought that was interesting on how they reflected the performance of their governance. towards taxpayers and their society. Oh, so thank you.
Thank you everyone for
Thank
coming.
you.
Please help yourself to refreshments outside the auditorium.